Welcome back, dudes. As always, this is the Bantz, and also as always, I am your host, the Bantz. As you can see, once again, we are up here, which once again means it's time for another What's Happening in Fashion Best of the Month, this time for the month of May. This is, of course, our look back on the best and my personal favorite art stories, fashion lookbooks, and fashion articles of the month of May. And of course, if you're new to this channel or to this series, this is going to be a long one. So if you want to skip ahead or skip to any part specifically, check the links down below. There will be plenty of them. So with all of that now said, let's just jump right into it. And first up, as always, we have our art stories. And as for our first art story, we have the mini documentary on legendary toy designer Michael Lau. If you're interested in learning a little bit more about him, his past works, what kind of led up to everything that is going on in his life today, specifically his art auction through Christie's, definitely check this out. It's short but definitely sweet. Then Kaws was back in the news, although for a rather strange reason this time. Basically, some of his more affluent collectors have decided to open up a website called Kaws for Lease, where you can actually rent out some of his artwork. So instead of paying thousands of dollars for a piece, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars for a piece, you can pay as little as a couple $100s a month to rent one instead. And I think this is a really super interesting idea. I mean, yes, in the past and even currently, artists have done things to make their work more accessible to the public through things like artist prints, posters, postcards, things like that. But how often have you heard of somebody getting the chance to actually put their hands on, in this case, an actual real Kaws painting for literally just a couple $100s? Sure, I can kind of understand some of the hesitation on this. I mean, the artist inside me personally would be super reluctant to hand over such an expensive piece to somebody for just a couple $100s. But on the other hand, this idea of giving the accessibility for just a couple $100s to somebody to put their hands on a piece, to put their eyes on a piece, which otherwise they might have to go to a museum or a private gallery to see, which many people don't have access to normally, I think makes this a very cool idea, and I'd love to see more artists hop on it in the future. Okay, and now moving on to our actual art for the month. First up, you know him, you love him, he's been around forever and he's not going anywhere anytime soon. The master Takashi Murakami showed off his newest exhibit, which is just about wrapped up in New York as we speak. But even so, if you haven't seen any of his newest works, definitely check these out. Just as amazing as always. Then, of course, we have the Beyond the Streets show going on in LA currently. Really, if you do have the chance to go out there and see this, I highly recommend it. Absolutely amazing show. Otherwise, definitely check out some of these photos. If you are a fan of graffiti or graffiti inspired art, or even some more interesting contemporary art, I guess you could say, definitely check this out. So many amazing artists here, it'll just make your head spin. Now moving on into our somewhat lesser known artists. First up, we have Kindah Khalidy's newest works. Really interesting and amazing overall, very bright and vibrant and colorful. And if I had to specifically describe it, think Todd James meets the medium of textiles. It's very interesting stuff, and whether you're a fan of fashion or art, either way, I think you might like some of the photos here. Then Koralie showed off some of her newest works, and these are just phenomenal. Very symmetrical, very pattern heavy, very kind of plant-based inspired, if you will, and the color schemes that go along with these really magnificent as well. if patterns are definitely your thing, then this will be right up your alley. Then we had a chance to see Joana Choumalis' newest works, and these are some of the most interesting pieces I have seen in a long time. Basically, she's taking photography that she's done herself and then adding actual embroidery to it to help make these photos pop and give them some more texture and patterns that they wouldn't have otherwise necessarily. And really, what an interesting concept. I mean, we've seen people use a ton of different mediums such as stitching before in painting, but never in photography, at least in that I know of. This is completely new to me. And with that, if you are a fan of kind of seeing how photography can kind of reach the next level, definitely check this out. Next, we had Vernon O'Meally's newest works, and all I gotta say is wow. Definitely described as psychedelic, and how could you really see it as otherwise? Very pattern heavy once again, very nice use of neon colors and the aesthetic of the black lights that go along with it. Really nice touch. If you remember kind of the not as popular as he used to be works by Ryan McGinnis, and you really enjoyed those, then definitely check these out. You will not be disappointed. Then we got a very brief look at graffiti artist Gat's newest works, and if the idea of taking really heavily influenced pattern design from Aztec culture and then mixing it with a very cool squid-like creature and then throwing it across a bunch of different mediums sounds interesting to you, then definitely check this out. And lastly, we had the Modern Art of Floating World exhibit, and honestly, such a cool idea, taking these really ancient Eastern Asian art styles and then mixing them in with a bunch of current pop culture references. Such a cool idea, such an interesting juxtaposition, and if either of those things sounds interesting to you, definitely worth a look here. And for you designer toy fans, we do actually have one story for you as well too. Kidrobot just released their newest collection of dunnies, this time inspired by Jean-Michel Basquiat. So if you are a fan of either person or company, then definitely check these out. They are moving fast, so get your hands on them as soon as possible. Alright, and now moving on into everybody's favorite section, the fashion section. First up, we do have a couple fashion stories for the month. First of which is the Uniqlo UT Wear the World exhibit, which is just such an incredible idea. Basically what happened is a bunch of people that worked behind the scenes at Uniqlo UT, which is of course their more heavy graphic design / collaboration department, got together and picked out almost 8,000 of their favorite designs over the 15-year history of the sub-brand, and basically brought them all together to show them off as an archive to the world. I mean, how cool is that? Of course, they're not the only brands to ever keep an archive of close to, if not, everything they've ever produced. But even so, how many other brands have taken all their designs, or close to all their designs, taken them out into the public domain and allowed access for the entire public to see? The only real downside to this is that the only location that this exhibit is in currently is in Toronto, Ontario, so you have to go there to see it, and if you are in the area, definitely check it out. Really incredible exhibits, and let's just hope they decided to take this to a couple more places in the future. I would definitely like to see it somewhere in the Southwest United States for sure, even if I had to drive for it. Then in a blast from the past, we had YouTube channel Sneaker News bring Ari and his Menthol 10s back to the spotlight. Really nostalgic if you happened to be a part of that era of streetwear, which I personally was. So seeing it again was really cool. Just really fun to see again in my mind, especially getting to hear a lot more of the history about it from the man himself. So if you are a fan of streetwear history or want to know a little bit more about the sneaker game or what it was like 10 years ago, then definitely check this out. Super interesting story and super interesting channel as well. And now it is time for our lookbooks of the month. And first up we have our contemporary wear brands. There wasn't really many that stood out this month, but there was two in my mind that were worth talking about. And starting us off, we had the lookbook from Moncler, their spring summer 2018 lookbook to be precise, and honestly it was as gorgeous as it was long and full of different ideas. Moncler just killed it in this lookbook. First off, a huge amount of pieces in this lookbook, but then even more so than that, they're so nicely diversified and varied. It's just a really nice sight to see. Of course, they start off with their more renowned colors in their red, white, and blue aesthetics, but it's not just limited to colors. There's different patterns, there's different textiles, there's different silhouettes, different pieces in general, and all of them feel fresh and vibrant. And even more vibrant still were some of the more maximalized pieces here, in just a plethora of different colors and different patterns, really not even taking center stage because everything in this lookbook was so good. There was even nicer, cleaner, more toned down pieces in not just a variety of colors, but also in just a traditional black if you were going for something purely not for aesthetic but more for functionality's sake. And on the flip side, they even had some really unique, really experimental pieces that I would never ever expect from a company like Moncler. But hey, maybe the genius line they've been working on the side has started to rub off on the other designers working there. And speaking of some crazy maximalized contemporary wear, we had the newest lookbook from Polo by Ralph Lauren, specifically their limited edition CP93 collection. And even though this wasn't the biggest of lookbooks or had the largest amount of pieces in this collection, and hell, you can even argue that a lot of the maximalized patterns on here were kind of recycled a little too much, but even so, I think they did an absolutely stunning job here. Unlike many other forms of maximalism that more rely on either an all-over print or maybe a gaudy attachment or embroidery here or there, this maximalism feels almost more like somebody had taken a painting and applied it to whatever piece of clothing they decided on here. And yes, even though I did say that some might think that some of the designs here are a little bit too overused, I do have to give Ralph Lauren props, because even though you do get a lot of the aesthetics from a lot of the same graphics in a lot of these pieces, the fact of the matter is that they've been done on so many different types of pieces, whether you're talking shorts or polo shirts or jackets or hats. That amount of variety makes this really much more interesting and much more okay in my book. So shout out to both brands, really. Thank you for really bringing in some really nice, really well done maximalism and showing everybody how good maximalism can really be when done correctly. Alright, and now it's time for our streetwear of the month. And fortunately, there were a lot more than last month. Definitely 5 brands here that outshone the rest for the month of May. And up first, and probably to nobody's surprise, we had the collaboration between Primitive and Dragon Ball Z, because this is really how a collaboration should be done. And that really means a lot when you think about how many other brands have collaborated with Dragon Ball Z in recent times. There's at least 4 I can think of. The names that come to mind are, of course, Uniqlo, Bape, that really shitty one that I covered, I think, like 2 weeks ago. But that's beside the point. The point is that when you look at this collection, it just feels like an actual collection. It's not just graphic tees, it's not just pullovers, it's shirts and hats and skate decks and accessories, among a bunch of other items. And as if that wasn't enough, the quality of these prints, of these graphics, of these pieces is super solid, especially compared to some of the other crap that some of these other collaborative brands have been putting out really recently. On top of this, Primitive took a lot of different color schemes and graphics and placed them together very nicely, to the point where you can actually make an entire outfit out of some of these pieces, which you really don't see a lot of streetwear brands doing nowadays. And of course, there is a cherry on top of this collection as well too, and that is the price. Excluding these skateboard decks, nothing in this collection is over $35. Let that sink in a little bit. Really amazing job, Primitive. I really look forward to seeing what collaboration you do next. Then we had the debut collection from obviously new brand Almost Always, and really such a well done job for a first season. Now I'll start off by getting my few little qualms out of the way. I'm not a huge fan of everything in this collection, but that really comes down to more a fan of my taste than it does bad quality pieces. And unfortunately, a couple of the pieces here still are just a tad too expensive. But other than that, otherwise a fairly fantastic collection overall. I mean, some of their influences really do shine through here. I mean, you can really tell that they were heavily inspired by brands like Undercover, but the graphics were done in such an interesting and playful style, and on top of that, the abundance of color they ended up using makes these feel more like an homage than a rip, which is fantastic because so many other companies do it the exact opposite way. Aside from that, they did have a bunch of different style aesthetics that they were going for that definitely ring true among this generation of streetwear. Outside of the bold colors, we do see some of the floral prints that are done, although done very well in my opinion, and also some of the tuxedo-esque pants with the side stripe down the side. Although, even though not personally a fan and would never ever wear them, these are still fairly nice in my opinion. And I do have to give a shout out to the transparency shirt. Very interesting idea, very aesthetically pleasing, and I'd love to see more designs like this. So once again, outstanding showing from Almost Always, and I am definitely looking forward to seeing what upcoming collections bring. Then, in the biggest surprise to probably ever be on this list, past, present, or future, even more so than the BBC collection that made it on a month or two ago. It's the collaboration between the Karate Kid and the Hundreds. Yeah, I'll be honest, it leaves a weird taste in my mouth. But as I always say, I will give credit where credit is due, and credit is definitely due here. This is not the biggest collection, and there definitely aren't the most amount of designs or creativity here, but even aside from that, the cohesiveness of the pieces is just amazing, and even more so than that, The graphics on these pieces, for the most part, there is a hiccup here or there, but aside from that, the graphics are just phenomenal. I really just said I think some graphics the hundreds did are phenomenal. Do you guys feel that? I think hell just froze over. So shoutouts to the hundreds. I would like to say I look forward to seeing some more collaborations that are this interesting, but I really just don't want to be let down again. Up next, we have by far the most interesting streetwear collection I have seen in a while, and of course it comes from none other than the newest collection by Advisory Board Crystals. There is just so much going on in this collection, and it's a huge collection to begin with, so there's definitely a lot going on here. The more simple pieces are still bright and colorful, and their quality is still on point, as well as their graphics, which are very interesting and very creative, and of course their aesthetics are on point as well. But going on with that point of aesthetics, holy fucking hell does ABC go far and above what it means to add aesthetics to pieces. And who could forget the Wikipedia page on the lining of some of their coats? But really, if there's one piece that shows the culmination of all these things, it's that fucking crystal pullover, which actually has crystals sewn into the piece, along with some little word bubbles, kind of connecting them together, giving them descriptions of sorts. I mean, who the fuck thinks of these things? Really, the only downside to this collection and to this brand as a whole is that it is way too fucking expensive. Is it cool? Hell yeah. Is it worth it? Fuck no. But that still doesn't make me any less excited to see this collection and of course see what crazy things they come up with next. And lastly, and definitely not least in our streetwear lookbooks, we have the newest collaboration between Playboy and Freak Store, and this is just amazing. When people tell you about why it's so important to do quality over quantity, they're talking about collaborations like this. Now, we're not going to talk about the hats because the hats suck. So aside from that, there are only 6 pieces in this collection. 3 button-up short sleeves and 3 t-shirts. And you know what? It is still my favorite collaboration of the month by far. And I know you might say that the idea of the all-over print has been done before, and some would even argue done to death, and some would even say the fact that the only difference between the all-over prints here is that one is grayscale and one is full color, and some would even argue that the other print, the other all-over print, is just a checkerboard, which has been done before by fucking everybody. I mean, just look at Vans. I mean, for fuck's sake, really, just look at Vans. And you know what? I would agree with you if these pieces weren't just so freaking cool. You can definitely tell the quality is there on these pieces, which especially for an all-over print is extremely hard to do, especially one as maximalized and pattern heavy as this. And if you really sit down and look at some of these graphics, some of these patterns for just a little bit of time, you can really just come to understand how nice, how quality they actually are. It's not like they just slapped a bunch of Playboy magazines together and just copy pasted it. It's definitely a little bit more than that. And that little bit more is all the quality it needs to put it above and beyond in my mind. On top of that, the prices here are definitely not terrible, especially for Japanese standards. So if you are a fan of some really nice, really maximalized pieces, especially in streetwear. Definitely check these out. Some of them are still available and totally worth picking up if you can. And lastly, there is one more fashion lookbook of the month. And is it my favorite? Because normally I leave the favorite till the end. I gotta honestly say no, mainly because there is not a chance in hell that I could ever pull off any of these pieces. But that doesn't take away from the fact that they are just super interesting, and that collection is the collaboration between Nepenthes and Sasquatchfabrix in their newest Chillin' collection. Now, obviously, these pieces are heavily inspired by Japanese culture. I mean, for fuck's sake, most of them are basically, if not, kimonos. But even so, the colors on some of these pieces, the quality on some of these pieces, the patterns on some of these pieces, and even the accessories are just so fucking incredible. I mean, how can you, as a fashion lover, not look at this and just be awed or amazed, or I can't help but smile? And of course, not everybody would be able to pull these off, but even so, I couldn't help but respect somebody if they tried, even if it looked like shit on them. Just know that if I ever happen to see you in public wearing one of these things, I will definitely come up and shake your fucking hand, because Lord only knows you fucking deserve it for the amount of confidence you have. Okay, now let's move into our articles for the month. And first up, we have our 3 interviews worth talking about. The first of which being Hisnabayety's interview with Raif Adelberg, who is a trendsetter of sorts in the Canadian streetwear scene. They dive deep into his history and show how much, or at least how ahead of his time he was, whether that be by being one of the first people to stock Balenciaga or Rick Owens all the way back in the early 2000s, or even by taking a Louis Vuitton bag and customizing it into sneakers that ended up selling at Union NY or even Undefeated. And there are a bunch of interesting stories like that in this interview. And then finally going on to talk about how much things have changed with the evolution of the internet and kind of with the lack of knowledge that comes along with it. Very interesting article, and if you're once again interested in history of streetwear, definitely worth looking into. Then we had Hypebeast's interview with Eugene Tong, the once fashion journalist, now creative consultant, who really kind of talks about his history in fashion and how he learned about it through things like magazines, because the internet wasn't around in that point in time, and how since the internet has become such a powerhouse that it has, how things have changed, sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worse. Once again, a very interesting interview, and if you are part of the newer generation and kind of want to learn a little bit more about the older generations and how they learned about style, definitely read this. And lastly, the interview with Zach Clark, the designer/owner behind brand Fuck the Population, and another very interesting article, although a little bit different than the other two, because we see a brand here that was very much influenced by streetwear brands of the 90s and early aughts, done by somebody who is significantly younger than most of these people. I mean, at the time of this article in 2018, the guy is 23. Like, that's fucking crazy. But even so, they talk a lot about the kind of counterculture that went alongside with a lot of streetwear, and how some brands really kind of pioneered it and how he was trying to revive it. Really another interesting read if you are a huge fan of streetwear and really just counterculture in general. Alright, and now for the rest of our articles. First up, we have another grailed history of, this time on the history of engineered garments. If you are a fan of Japanese brands, or maybe just brands that have a heavy aesthetic on mountaineering, definitely give this a read. Very interesting history. Grailed also put out a very in-depth article on the idea of the drop, basically this idea of how streetwear brands kind of make things exclusive through the idea of only dropping pieces or collections in very small amounts or at incremental times, and they kind of go into the psychology of it, the secondary market of it, and how the internet has changed a lot of things along with it. So once again, if you're a fan of streetwear and a fan of history of streetwear, definitely check this out. Then Fastco put out a fairly interesting article literally titled "Unbranding is Dumb," and they kind of go into the idea of why people have started unbranding and why from a psychological standpoint it's not such a good idea. And really, if you're looking at making clothes, especially when we're in this tide of maximalism, which will eventually fall back into a tide of minimalism, and that's more your style, or maybe you're just in marketing, either way, this has a lot of interesting and eye-opening ideas. Definitely look into it. Then Vox put out a very interesting article on the idea of people in fashion stealing and copying designs from one another, and they go into a deep history of it going back a couple decades. Then they talk a little bit about the copyright laws on it, and then they even go into the idea of why it might not necessarily be a bad thing for competition's sake. Overall, very interesting article. It can get a little dull in the copyright area, but I would at least skim over this. Very interesting read. And definitely even a little eye-opening for those of us that are so heavily against the idea of fakes. Then Heddles put out a history of the ball cap, because why the hell would I, of all people, not throw this in? But either way, if you are a fan of history of fashion or even history of accessories, definitely worth a read. Then High Snobiety put out a very interesting article on 4 ways sneaker brands generate hype, and they talk about things that were kind of mentioned in the other article, The Drop, things like incremental timing, smaller releases, specific releases to specific parts of the country or retailers. And overall, if you're looking to generate hype for maybe your small brand, or maybe you want to learn a little bit about it, or maybe once again you're in the marketing sector, either way, I would definitely check this one out too. Another really interesting article. We're almost there, guys. I promise, only 2 articles left. Then we had the really well written, really in-depth article from Rax about Anna Wintour and Vogue magazine. And starting off, they talk a little bit about the history of Vogue and how it worked along the years, but then they really get into the meat of it, talking about what happened after Anna Wintour became a part of the company, and how some of the things she's done, some of the ways she's pushed the brand, pushed the exclusivity of things, has really just kind of broadened the magazine and made it into the powerhouse it is today. And from there, they even talk about kind of how impactful it has been to the entirety of fashion journalism, and how much of a cultural icon Anna Wintour has become because of it. So really fascinating article. Obviously it has nothing to do with menswear, but if you are a fan of fashion history, especially fashion publication, this is definitely something you don't want to miss out on reading. And finally, yes, finally, Heddles put out a very interesting article on the idea of cost per wear, which I will go over once again, is the idea of taking the price of a specific item and then dividing it by the number of times it's worn to get your cost per wear. Makes sense, right? And from there, they go into this idea of why it's so important to buy high quality, yet usually more expensive items, because their cost of wear tends to be lower than stuff you get from fast fashion, but they also make sure to tell you that just because something's expensive, it doesn't mean the quality is there. And they even go into some other aspects about pieces, such as make sure you buy things that can be worn a long time but also be repaired if necessary, and things like that. So if you are one of those people that tends to be more interested in quality pieces and people have always given you shit for buying more expensive pieces, this will definitely help them see a little bit more in your light, or at least let's hope so. Alright guys, and with that we have come to the end of our What's Happening in Fashion Best of the Month of May. This was definitely a long one, but at the very least I hope you guys enjoyed it. And as always, if you want to read any of the articles I talked about today or see any extra photos I wasn't able to include from either artists or designers or whoever, I've linked all the articles I talked about today in the description down below. And if you are new to the channel and you made it this far, then first off, congratulations. But second of all, welcome. We do these What's Happening in Fashion videos twice a week on Mondays and Fridays, as well as these Best of the Months, obviously once a month. So if you are a fan and want to see more, feel free to subscribe. Otherwise, if you have any questions or comments or concerns, or even just want to talk fashion in general, feel free to hit me up in the comments down below. I am always willing to talk fashion. And thank you guys as always for watching these videos and supporting my content. I do actually expect to see a couple more interesting videos coming along in the near future, so be on the lookout for those. And I hope you guys have a good couple of days off until I see you next. And of course, as always, until next time.